First up, I do want to mention the winner of the Candid GTX 1080 giveaway. That person is Nafal Raihansia. Sorry if I butchered that name. It looks like you're from India, Nafal, so I'll be giving you a DM in Instagram in the coming hours after I edit this video here. Congratulations on the win. Again, it doesn't matter where you live, folks. I mean, it's either going to be the card itself that I deliver to you, or if that's not possible, I'll be sending you the equivalent US dollar amount of whatever the card costs. In this case, Candid delegated $620 US for GTX 1080. So worst case, that's what you'll get, but I'm going to try my best to get the card over there because I know the card is extremely expensive in many places around the world. Now let's discuss the topic of this video, and that is AMD Zen versus Intel Kaby Lake. In particular, I want to test the viability of AMD's Zen claims, their 40% IPC jump, and also their very intriguing head-to-head comparison between their 8-core 16-thread Zen behemoth and the i7-6900K, which, I should mention, is a $1,000 processor. This video is not going to be very long. I'm not a huge fan of strictly speculation videos, although there are a few things that we can say are substantially different between Zen and old FX architecture, namely Bulldozer and Piledriver architectures. We'll also be using Excavator as a stepping stone, if you will, to get to that 40% IPC improvement between Excavator and Zen that AMD has been touting for months. And on Intel's side, we'll be discussing whether or not waiting for Kaby Lake is even a smart idea, especially if you're sporting a Skylake processor right now, and whether or not Zen has anything to worry about when it comes to that new Intel architecture, which, spoiler alert, isn't really all that different. First things first, let's validate AMD's claim that Zen is in fact a 40% IPC improvement over Excavator. Thankfully, we have a physical benchmark for this, but I will say, as a disclaimer, this is a test conducted by AMD in an effort to promote an AMD product. I'm not saying that AMD would skew their results in an effort to make their product look superior to their competitors, but this is a company we're talking about. I would say the exact same thing about Intel, Starbucks, you get the point. If you want my 2 cents, I say wait until reviewers like myself and others get our hands on these processors, pit them head to head, clock for clock, and we'll really see what these things can do. Until then, I would take everything that you see with a grain of salt. So in this test right here, an AMD 8-core 16-thread Zen CPU with simultaneous multi-threading, it's basically AMD's equivalent to hyper-threading, barely outperforms an i7-6900K, both of which are running at the exact same frequency. This is just one test, mind you, and I do expect that AMD took that engineering sample and threw it in a batch of tests against the 6900K, found that the blender test resulted in the greatest disparity, and decided to showcase that one to the public just because it does make Zen look the best. I don't blame them, I would do it too. It is possible that the 6900K outperformed the Zen counterpart in something like Cinebench R15. They just decided not to show that one because, well, it's not going to make their CPU look as good as the $1,000 competitor. Nonetheless, we can use this performance test to validate AMD Zen's IPC claim. Now, because IPC, which stands for instructions per clock, is a measurement essentially of single-core performance at a given frequency, we can correlate multiple architectures. This isn't an exact science, and you can't correlate these relationships to frame rate increases, for example. They just give us rough estimates of general architectural improvements and how much faster a CPU can process data. Let's start off with Piledriver as our baseline. This is the FX lineup, the FX 6300, 8350, you get the point. Because it's our baseline, we're going to say that its IPC is 100. It's just easier to correlate that way, but we could say it's 1, a million. It's an arbitrary number. As long as all of our other scores are in reference to that baseline, we'll be good to go. The first major jump for AMD was the release of the Excavator architecture, a notable 15% IPC improvement over Piledriver. You get these numbers, by the way, by multiplying the equivalent decimal increase in IPC by the previous baseline, so in this case 0.15 times 100. Take that product and add it to the previous baseline. That's 115 you're seeing here. And now for the jump from Excavator to Zen, AMD does of course claim the 40% IPC boost, so take 0.4, multiply it by 115, and then take that product, add it to the previous baseline of 115 to yield roughly 160 or so, which you can read this 2 ways. You can say that it's either a 40% improvement over Excavator, or because Piledriver is our baseline of 100, roughly 61% IPC improvement over Piledriver. Now let's quickly move on over to Intel. Ivy Bridge had an IPC improvement over Piledriver of about 50% or so, and these architectures were released around the same time. At this point, AMD favored higher core counts, and Intel favored higher single-core performance, which is why you see these IPC disparities here. One company banked on one thing, and the other company banked on another. So with Ivy Bridge as our baseline on the Intel side at roughly 150, we can correlate the other IPC improvements from Haswell to Broadwell E to Skylake. If you notice here, these three jumps are indicative of about a 4% IPC improvement overall. Intel really hasn't been pushing it lately, and that's something that I hope Zen changes. If we do the math, this lands Haswell at 156, Broadwell E at 162, and Skylake at 168. Now let's merge both our Intel and Zen IPC graphs. And check that out. Zen and Broadwell E are literally neck and neck, I would say within the margin of error if our original IPC improvements are correct. And that falls exactly in line with what AMD showed us in their Blender test. Now, because of what we just saw, I would say with relative certainty that what AMD did show us with their 8-core 16-thread CPU is accurate. Now, this goes back to something we mentioned just a bit earlier. When we talk about the generation jumps from Haswell to Broadwell E to Skylake and even to Kaby Lake, the focus for them has been more on single-core performance improvements and not necessarily packing more cores into a single die. This can have substantial impacts on the frame rates that you see in games, as well as how programs utilize their various cores at their disposals. Now, frequency also plays a role there, essentially cores versus clocks. We've discussed that in a few videos. But when it comes to AMD, it seems like Zen is taking the exact same approach that its predecessor, Piledriver, did several years earlier. What this tells me is that AMD is still focused on future-proofing their CPUs, banking on the fact that multiple programs will be able to utilize more than 4 cores efficiently in the next few years. That, by the way, is what ultimately led to the downfall of Bulldozer and Piledriver back in 2011. See this video right here for more details. Nonetheless, based on what we know and can safely speculate, I do expect that a 4-core 8-thread Zen CPU will compete admirably against a 6700K Skylake counterpart, clock for clock. That's good news for those of you interested in something that's, well, more affordable than the Intel equivalent. Now let's change vantage points. From Intel's point of view, Kaby Lake. Not a huge improvement over Skylake. There are a few architectural changes. We're still running on a 14nm process, a few changes in the H.265 codec, how videos are interpreted, TDP, power draw is slightly different, but for the most part it's just a refined 6700K, and you won't see hardly any difference with the Kaby Lake processors over the Skylake processors, maybe when it comes to motherboard features and things like that. But if you're currently sporting a 66 or 6700K, or I would argue even a 46 or 4790K, that jump from Haswell or Skylake to Kaby Lake is not justified by a $350 or so US dollar price tag. You could make the case that Kaby Lake brought substantial improvements to the mobile side of things. Actually, you know what? No, you really can't. Apart from marginal battery life increases, I would say same thing. Buying a 6200U instead of a 7200U is actually going to be the smarter thing to do if it means saving $300. It's just the trend Intel has been on lately, and I expect that a large chunk of that reason is because AMD really hasn't given them anything with which to compete. I mean, just look at these IPC changes for Intel. In this case, we want to see a very shallow trend line indicative of substantial improvements from generation to generation, but we're not seeing that. We're seeing a very sharp trend line. So when Zen finally works its way into the mix, we can expect one of three things to happen with respect to Intel. The first is that Intel finally lowers its CPU prices. Be very skeptical of this one. I am for sure, because if you look at something like a 4460, that processor is still going to put you back 170 or so US dollars, and if you compare that to a 6400, the Skylake counterpart, that processor is about 180 bucks. You're looking at a $10 disparity from generation to generation. These processors don't depreciate very well, and people still buy them. The second thing that could happen is Intel radically changes the architecture of either its mobile or desktop CPU lineup in the future, again setting itself apart from AMD, creating a sort of barrier to competition, and ultimately not lowering its prices at all. And then there's the third thing. Intel continues to charge the exact same prices it used to charge for its future CPU generations. That's actually the one that I think will happen. I don't think Intel cares that AMD is finally competing. I think that they think a majority of its consumer base will remain a majority of its consumer base. That's bad news for AMD, and that's definitely bad news for us. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, give it a dislike. If you feel the complete opposite, be sure to click the subscribe button if you haven't already. If you disagree with me, let's duke it out in the comments. This is Salazar Studio. Thanks for learning with us.